Hey, how's it going, everyone? Today I have the pleasure of being joined by Finchinator to help explain what makes Pokemon overpowered or too over-centralizing. If you're not familiar, Finch is not only a former OU tier leader and sitting OU council member, but he's also a very decorated competitive player across multiple generations and a great YouTuber, which I'll be sure to throw a link to in the description below. Finch, thanks so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, and I'm glad to hear you're doing well, but let's just jump right into it, because I think most people are pretty on board with understanding why something like Zacian is clearly too strong for overused. But when it comes to something a little bit more nuanced, like a Magearna or maybe a Choice Specs Kyurem who actually isn't banned, but still considered very strong, how do you judge when a Pokemon is considered overpowered?
Well, I think there are a couple ways to do it. First off, there's the in-battle effect. You might notice a Pokemon ends up sweeping more often than not. Odds are that Pokemon will be a problem. And then there's actually what I like to look at a lot more, and that's how it impacts team building. For example, when you look at Cinderace and Magearna suspect tests, or say prior ones to that, you notice a lot of the language used is, oh, this Pokemon warps team building or restricts team building. A lot of Pokemon, they have counters just because there are so many hundreds of options out there. You could find one counter, but having used that single counter or check on every single team is a problem. So the difference between something that's very good might be that, okay, there's a wider array of counters, and yes, it's still good, but it at least can be kept in check, whereas something that might be broken might only have one or two things that if you have to use one or two things on every single team, that's kind of where I draw the line personally. And, since it is arbitrary, but I think that we have it down to, I don't want to say a perfect science, but we have it down to an, okay, this is an appropriate amount. And I'd say that if you really feel hindered, like every builder and every tier kind of has a checklist in their mind when they build a team, I'd say, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And if that checklist is limited to such a significant extent that like one Pokemon in that checklist keeps popping up as an error time and time again that you have to go out of your way for, that's kind of where you draw the line, I'd say. It's definitely not a perfect science, though, and that's why we have community votes and suspects, because everyone has their own opinion on things, and that's what I think makes the process go as it does.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because this might be a pedantic question, but my thought was, is there like a number of Pokemon that you think need to check a threat for it to be considered not over centralizing, or do you think it's really just a feel thing, like you kind of mentioned?
So my personal opinion is no, there's not a number, because that number is kind of an eye of the beholder. For example, do you mind if I use an example from the current metagame?
Of course not. I prefer it.
So let's look at our Shifu, something that I personally believe is broken. Right now, you have to use one of Clefable or Weezing Galar to keep it really in check. Mm-hmm. However, people could argue, okay, but sometimes I use something like a really defensive Primarina or a Azumarill on Hyper Offense or 3 or 4 faster Pokemon and I keep it in check. And that's true. So then all of a sudden, instead of it being Weezing or Clefable, you could argue there are like 6 or 10 Pokemon. Whereas in my personal opinion, those Pokemon, it's more of a collective and it's more fringe scenarios. So in my opinion, it's more like 2 or 3 Pokemon keep it in check. So for me, that number can really vary based on the eye of the beholder. So it's more based on feel. And sure. I feel that when I'm building with a balanced team or even a bulky offensive team, I always have to use Clefable or a UU Pokemon like Weezing Galar to keep it in check. And therefore, it's too problematic. But let's say there were 5 or 7 more viable fairy types that have completely distinct niches from Clefable. All of a sudden, then I think would be more balanced. So it's somewhere in that range, but it's hard to pinpoint it because also you have to keep in mind that some Pokemon have more offensive counterplay, i.e. things that can revenge kill it. So if it's a very slow Pokemon, that could be the case. Or some Pokemon maybe rely more on other team support. And that's when it becomes so complicated because every Pokemon is so unique. And I'd say that's really a distinctive factor. That's what it makes it more feel-based than opposed to something that you could find a definition of.
Well, that's a great response, but I also want to clarify because you already touched on it, but on the topic of over-centralizing Pokemon, what do you think separates something from Dracovish or the Urshifu you just mentioned from a Pokemon like Choice Specs Latios, which is very central and black and white overused, right? Where there is counters, and there's probably more counters than one you listed. Where do you think that line is between centralizing and just plain outright over-centralizing?
That's a great question. And I want to say that the opinion that Latios is broken in Black White OU is not a bad one at all. Like, I completely understand. And if we look at modern standards, you could make that argument, but something that's really interesting is the way that our tiers trend. Because right now, Clefable and, say, Seismitoad back when Drakefish was allowed, if you remember Seismitoad is in every team, those Pokemon were essentially forced upon you because you had to counter Dracovish, you had to counter Shifu, etc. In Black and White, counterplay to Latios is a bit less one-dimensional. As in, yes, you could use Tyranitar with Pursuit, but also Tyranitar is there for Euniclus, it's there for Alakazam, it's there for changing the weather against rain teams. Okay, that's great. But then also on rain teams, there are staples like Ferrothorn, or semi-staples, if you will, like Drachi, and there's a ton of users with Protect, which are able to scout out the choice sets that make it so that you're at least a lot less linear. You're not forced to do the same thing over and over and over again. So in a sense, that goes back to what we're saying about feel. As in, I feel that there are multiple modes of common counterplay to Latios and Black-White that, while it is a centralizing force, the metagame, A, centralizes a bit around it in a good way, and B, these things, such as using Ferrothorn on rain, help for other things than just Latios. They set up spikes, it checks, opposing water attackers, or Tyranitar on sand, it checks other psychic types, it checks Tornadus and Thunderous, it changes the weather, etc. Whereas in SS, yes, Clefable's a very versatile Pokemon, but I mean, we saw before Urshifu was so good, during, say, the months of June and July, Clefable's usage was less than half of where it was now in tournaments, and still not near where it was in a ladder. And something like Weezing Galar, it very much did not exist in OU. There's a reason it dropped straight to UU. So the fact of the matter is that I think it's just looking at trends and how much a Pokemon really dictates how we build. I think that's a big part of it to me.
I would also point out in the difference, my first thought was maybe it's a bit reductive on the greater point you put it out there, but steel types are always going to be extremely useful in Black and White. Like I saw an SPL game the other day where someone used mono steel and it was still extremely successful regardless of if a Latios is against the field. Whereas you almost need a mono fairy in SS to deal with Urshifu, right? Or you almost, and I mentioned Dracovish in that example. Dracovish, even a resist wasn't enough. You needed a water absorber or an extremely defensive counter to it. So I feel like a steel type is a much broader category.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing with Dracovish was, and in my opinion, Dracovish is worse than something like Urshifu will ever be, is Dracovish just straight out invalidated so much. Like, you basically, in that metagame, had to use one of Seismitoad, Gastrodon, or Baneful Bunker Toxapex. And, I mean, it forces you to not use offensive teams, because all of those Pokemon didn't really work, like, on super offensive teams. Like, just a Scarf Dracovish alone invalidated the entire hyper-offensive archetype, for example, because you're not fitting any of those hyper-offense. Even bulky offense, it was forced to use Seismitoad as the rocker, which then forces other defensive Pokemon, because what Seismitoad can't cover, they have to cover, and so on and so forth. It basically makes it so that you go from a tier where hundreds of Pokemon are viable to all of a sudden you only have, dozens of Pokemon you'll commonly see, unless you want to take the gamble that you won't face Dracovish. And basically incentivizing that gamble is not something that I view as healthy, because we want a metagame where you could use bulky offense, balance, stall, hyper offense, etc., and everything in between. And Pokemon that directly prohibit that and limit what you do make it so that the tier is less fun, less versatile, and just less playable. And because of that, I think something like Dracovish, or even, again, to a much lesser extent, Urshifu, is problematic.
I love that point you brought up about it kind of invalidating offense, because that's a pet peeve of mine, is especially, again, a lot of this is focused towards newcomers, and it's just a simple misunderstanding. I don't want to say this in a phrasing of like looking down on them, but you often hear language to the effect of like, oh man, Dracovish is banned. It seems like they just want to ban all the cool offensive mons, when in reality, banning Dracovish is actually helping offense, because it forces you, it means you don't have to have the same, pigeonholed counters just to deal with every Dracovish that you come up against.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's funny because I don't know if you guys are familiar. There's this tournament called the Official Ladder Tournament, which took place a couple months ago. And when that tournament happened, a lot of people started using these teams called hyper-offensive teams, where you have a lot of win conditions and fast offensive threats that all work together to break down defensive teams. And for me, that's one of my favorite play styles, because it generates a fast game and you're able to really strategize offensively. And that's a cool concept to me. And those teams simply were not usable at all when Dracovish was in a tier, because Choice Scarf Dracovish can beat them in, 8 turns. There are replays of just Dracovish clicking Fish's Rend once you get 20% chip on a Dragapult, and all of a sudden everything just dies.
We're really gonna stop calling it Scarf Dracovish and really just Fish's Rend the move.
Yeah, Fish's Rend, that simple. And when the game is dumbed down that much and something so otherwise viable is limited, that's when you know there's a problem in my eyes.
Mm-hmm. Well, great, because you've already given me exactly what I'm looking for in terms of answers, but I was hoping you could touch on a tricky topic, which is namely going to be Toxapex, because of course most of what I've talked about and what you mentioned today has been on offensive Pokemons, but I wanted to ask you if you think it's more or less difficult to judge if a Pokemon is over-centralizing if it's defensive instead of offensive. And in the case of Toxapex, I suppose, do you think we're reaching that point?
I think it's much harder. And that's coming from someone who's openly advocated for tox effects to get looked at. And I think that it changes. Like, my opinion on tox effects a month ago is different than my opinion on tox effects now. And that's because it's more reactive to the metagame around it. So let's get into some more examples, if you will. Tox effects is something that is seen on almost every single stall team. But in a metagame where stall is less effective, you see less tox effects. So all of a sudden, you're looking at the tier, and when stall is running rampant, you're noticing all of a sudden tox effects, in a sense, is having an eerily similar effect to Dracovish, in that it could haze all the setup sweepers, it could force status on offensive teams, which basically forces you to use something like Clefable, or your own tox effects, or Reuniculus, or another regenerator Pokemon that could soak up status and force it out in the long haul, basically. And because of that, it makes it so that there's a very limited pool of teams that work around tox effects. However, once you're able to, use more balanced teams, things like Kyurem, Reuniculus, Alakazam pop up more that not only can threaten it out, but also, take those hits. They don't mind being, scalded or poisoned into short haul. All of a sudden, those Pokemon will take advantage of it. So in a metagame where those Pokemon are thriving, which is close to the metagame right now, where we're seeing more balanced teams, maybe Toxapex is less broken, but in a metagame where we're seeing more hyper-offensive teams and there's less room to switch in, games go by quicker, Toxapex can just sit there and soft check everything, threaten everything, and for a Pokemon that can regenerate health out so quickly, that becomes a problem because you have to specifically build with it so much in mind, either using a very specific mold or you're just avoiding a whole archetype itself. And because of that, you have to see what the metagame is trending like to really analyze, is this defensive Pokemon broken or is it too much? And is stall thriving with it or because of it? And it takes this extra level of really metagame analysis. It's not just looking at, checks and counters, because there are dozens of Pokemon that can beat Toxapex 1v1, as we've said before, but rather, what is common? What is happening in the metagame? And does this react well to Toxapex, or does it just make Toxapex stand out? And that extra level of kind of, I want to say team analysis, but you could call it metagame analysis, I'd argue, it makes it harder to ban defensive Pokemon. And that's why maybe besides, say, Deoxys Defense or Mega Sableye bans within the last handful of years, the only bans that we've had on really defensive measures are trappers like Gothitelle and Dugtrio, which are very clear-cut cases as they're uncompetitive. So I understand why people are fed up that we don't see as many defensive Pokemon banned, but I'd also argue that the way we ban offensive Pokemon actually makes it so that these defensive Pokemon are less effective. And those trends kind of shift away. But I think we're at a point this generation where Toxapex is so good that we should be having these conversations. We should be pushing for, okay, maybe it's time to look at this. And if in the DLC 2 metagame, which comes out in a couple of weeks, we still feel similarly about Toxapex, which I have no clue if it'll be the case because we're going to be seeing so many new Pokemon, then I'm all for looking into it personally.
I mean, well, it's kind of like that message I sent you last week on ubiquity and whether a Pokemon that's so ubiquitous can become broken. And I don't know if I would make that case for Toxapex, but if there is anyone that you could make it for, it is Toxapex, because Toxapex is always doing some work, right? You could throw it on almost any team and it will put in some work. And so that ubiquity just kind of adds that defensive flavor that you mentioned, where it's always going to be doing something and there's never a reason not to, almost, it feels like.
I don't know if I would go that far.
Fair.
But you're like I'd agree 90%, but right now we're seeing things like, Reuniculus, Alakazam, Combine Thunderbolt, Clefable that are kind of making that ubiquity a bit less strong of an argument. But let's say we go back like right before those things really started trending, and they only trended because Toxapex got so good. That's the thing. So
and they're only really trending the last couple of weeks, am I wrong?
Yeah, it's really like we're talking going back into like the start of September, mid-September. Yeah. Like, let's say we go right before that, then I would agree with that. And the fact of the matter is, if that metagame state was possible to where Toxapex, it's always doing something, being knocking off an item or forcing a burn or forcing a poison or thwarting a setup sweep attempt, and it's coming in and out repeatedly with Regenerator without really any adverse effect, then maybe that's telling about where Toxapex was in the metagame. And maybe you are right in that sense about the ubiquity.
Well, that's perfect, Finch. You've really given some great answers to really all my questions. I really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me.
And to reiterate, you can find Finchinator on his YouTube channel. I implore you all to check him out if you haven't already. Is there any other social media you want to shout out or anything like that?
Not currently. I might be making a Twitter in the near future, but right now I don't have one. So just check out my channel if you guys could. And if not, thank you anyway. Have a great day.
Okay, well, it's great. Thanks, man. See you later.